I flew home for New Year's. The apartment was silent except for Grandpa watching TV alone. A crumpled note read, "Used your bonus for our getaway. He's your problem now." Grandpa whispered, "Don't worry, kiddo." I just smiled. 3 days later, they were blowing up my phone. I, 32M, stepped off the plane at JFK on December 29th, exhausted from the 14-hour flight from Singapore. The promotion had been everything I'd worked for, regional manager for Southeast Asia, complete with a substantial year-end bonus that would finally let me help my family. Mom had been struggling with Dad's medical bills since his stroke last year, and I'd been sending money when I could, but this bonus was different. This was life-changing money. The cab ride to Queens felt longer than usual. I'd been gone 8 months for the job transition, and the familiar streets looked different somehow. Maybe it was just the jet lag, or maybe it was the weight of anticipation. I couldn't wait to surprise Mom and Dad with the news about the bonus. Grandpa Joe had been living with them since Grandma passed 2 years ago, and I knew the cramped apartment was getting to everyone. I climbed the 3 flights to our old walk-up, my keys still fitting perfectly in the lock that had been sticking since I was in high school. But something felt wrong the moment I opened the door. The apartment was too quiet, too dark except for the blue glow of the television in the living room. Grandpa Joe sat in his worn recliner, the same spot he'd claimed since moving in. The volume was turned down low, and he was staring at some old Western movie. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his eyes. Not surprise, not even relief. Just a tired kind of sadness. I asked him where Mom and Dad were, expecting them to be at the grocery store or maybe visiting Dad's physical therapist. Grandpa gestured toward the kitchen table without saying a word. That's when I saw it. A piece of notebook paper, crumpled like someone had thrown it away and then smoothed it out again. The handwriting was Mom's, and the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. She'd written that they were sorry, but they'd used my bonus for a getaway they desperately needed. Dad's recovery had been harder than expected, and they needed time to reconnect. She said Grandpa was my problem now, that they'd be back in a few weeks, maybe longer. I read it 3 times before the reality sank in. My parents had accessed my account. They still had my banking information from when I'd set up automatic transfers for Dad's medical bills. They'd taken the entire bonus, $60,000, and disappeared on some vacation while leaving their 84-year-old father behind like an unwanted pet. Grandpa watched me process this information. He told me not to worry about it, that everything would work out. His voice was gentle, the same tone he'd used when I was 8 and had broken Mom's favorite vase. But this wasn't a childhood accident. This was betrayal on a scale I couldn't comprehend. I asked Grandpa how long they'd been gone. 5 days, he said. They'd left right after Christmas, which meant they'd been planning this for weeks. The bonus had hit my account on December 23rd, and they'd transferred it out on December 26th. Boxing Day seemed appropriate somehow. The next morning, I called my bank. The transfer had been legitimate. My parents had full access to the account for medical emergencies. The customer service representative sympathized, but explained there was nothing they could do. The money was gone. I tried calling Mom's cell phone. Straight to voicemail. Dad's phone was the same. Their social media accounts had been deactivated. They'd planned this disappearance with military precision. Grandpa and I settled into an odd routine over the next few days. I cooked meals that reminded me of Grandma's recipes, and he told me stories I'd never heard before. Stories about Dad as a young man, about the choices that had led to this moment. Grandpa had never been one to sugarcoat things, and he didn't start now. He explained how Dad had always taken shortcuts, always looked for easy solutions. The gambling problem in the 90s that Grandpa had covered up. The business loan that had gone bad in 2008, which Grandpa had also quietly resolved. Mom had enabled it, he said, always making excuses, always smoothing over the consequences. I realized this wasn't just about the money. This was about a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades. I was just the latest source of funding for their problems. On New Year's Day, I made some phone calls. First to a local elder care service, arranging for someone to check on Grandpa twice a week. Then to a handyman to fix the things around the apartment that had been broken for months. I used my credit cards, knowing the bonus money was gone, but determined to take care of the one person who'd always been there for our family. That evening, Grandpa asked me what I was planning to do about Mom and Dad. I told him I was still figuring it out, but I had some ideas. He nodded and went back to his crossword puzzle, but I caught him smiling slightly. I spent the next 2 days researching. It's amazing what you can discover about someone's activities when you know their social security numbers and have access to their financial history. I found the resort in Costa Rica where they were staying. I found their return flights, booked for January 15th. I found the credit cards they'd maxed out in addition to stealing my money. More importantly, I found their vulnerability. The apartment lease was in Dad's name, but Grandpa had been the co-signer and guarantor since Dad's credit was shot from previous financial mishaps. The utility bills were in Mom's name, but again, Grandpa was the backup responsible party. Their entire life was built on my grandfather's good credit and lifetime of responsibility. I called the landlord on January 3rd. I explained that I was Grandpa's grandson and had power of attorney for his affairs while my parents were indisposed. I asked about transferring the lease to Grandpa's name entirely, removing my parents as tenants. The landlord, who'd dealt with my parents' late rent payments for years, was surprisingly accommodating. I called the utility companies with a similar story. Grandpa needed to be the primary account holder for his own protection. More paperwork, more fees paid with my credit card, but within 24 hours, Mom and Dad were no longer legal residents of the apartment they'd called home for 15 years. Then I called their bank. The account they'd transferred my money to was joint with Grandpa as the primary holder, another legacy of Dad's bad credit. I explained that there had been some unauthorized activity, that someone had accessed funds meant for Grandpa's medical care. As his power of attorney, I needed to freeze the account and protect his assets. The bank rep was helpful. Too helpful, really. Within an hour, their account was frozen pending investigation. The credit cards linked to that account were also suspended. Mom and Dad were now stranded in Costa Rica with whatever cash they had on hand. I made one final call to the Costa Rican resort. I explained that there had been a family emergency, that Mr. and Mrs. last name would need to settle their bill immediately as there were issues with their payment method. The concierge was very understanding and assured me they would speak with my parents right away. Grandpa watched me make these calls from his recliner, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. When I finished, he asked if I felt better. I told him I felt like I was finally taking care of family business the right way. 3 days later, on January 6th, my phone started buzzing. First Mom, then Dad, call after call. I let them go to voicemail. The messages started desperate and quickly turned angry. They were stuck at the resort with a massive bill they couldn't pay. Their cards weren't working. They couldn't reach their bank. They needed me to fix this immediately. I played the messages for Grandpa. He listened to each one carefully, his expression never changing. When the last message finished, Dad screaming about family loyalty and respect, Grandpa looked at me and asked what I planned to do next. I told him I was going to let them figure it out, the same way they'd expected me to figure out Grandpa's care when they abandoned him. Grandpa nodded and turned back to his Western. Update 1. The calls continued for 2 days. By January 8th, the messages were becoming increasingly frantic. Mom left a tearful voicemail explaining that they'd borrowed money from other guests at the resort and were essentially being held until they could pay their bill. Dad's messages alternated between rage and pleading. I finally answered on the evening of January 8th. Mom was crying before I said hello. She begged me to understand, to remember that they were family, that they'd only taken the money because they were desperate. Dad got on the phone and demanded to know what I'd done to their accounts. I explained calmly that I'd simply protected Grandpa's interests while they were away. Since they'd made it clear in their note that Grandpa was my responsibility, I'd taken steps to ensure his financial security. The apartment lease, the utilities, the bank accounts, everything was now properly arranged to protect an elderly man who'd been abandoned by his family. Dad started shouting about theft and legal action. I reminded him that accessing someone else's bank account without permission was also theft, and that I had documentation of every transaction. I also mentioned that Grandpa's power of attorney had been updated to reflect his new living situation, which meant any legal challenges would need to go through his representative, me. Mom took the phone back and asked what I wanted from them. I told her I wanted exactly what they'd given Grandpa, nothing. They'd made their choice when they left him alone with a note calling him my problem. Now they could live with the consequences. I hung up and didn't answer the next 15 calls. Update 2. On January 10th, I received a call from the American consulate in Costa Rica. A very professional woman explained that my parents had contacted them about a family emergency that had left them stranded. She was calling to verify that there had indeed been such an emergency and to see if family members could assist with their return to the United States. I confirmed that yes, there had been a family emergency. My grandfather, an 84-year-old man, had been abandoned by his son and daughter-in-law, who had stolen money from their other son and fled the country. I was currently caring for my grandfather and had limited resources to assist anyone else. The consulate officer paused, clearly not expecting that response. She asked if I would be willing to provide funds for my parents' return travel. I explained that unfortunately, they had depleted the family's emergency resources before their departure, and I was now focused on ensuring my grandfather's welfare. She thanked me for the clarification and said they would explore other options with my parents. 2 hours later, Mom called from a different number. She'd found someone at the resort willing to let her use their phone. She was sobbing, begging me to reconsider, saying they'd made a mistake, but they were still family. She promised they would pay back every penny of the bonus money. I asked her how exactly they planned to pay it back. Dad hadn't worked since his stroke, and Mom's part-time job at the department store barely covered groceries. Even if they had good intentions, $60,000 was more than they'd make in 3 years. She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I would make them a deal. If they could find their way back to New York on their own, if they could prove they were serious about taking responsibility for their actions, then we could discuss what came next. But first, they needed to demonstrate the same resourcefulness they'd shown in accessing my bank account and planning their escape. Mom asked what would happen to them if they couldn't get home. I told her that wasn't my problem to solve. They'd made it clear that family members were only problems to be dumped on others when convenient. Update 3. On January 12th, I received a call from my uncle, Dad's brother, who lived in Phoenix. He was furious. Mom had somehow tracked down his number and called him, explaining that I was holding the family hostage over money and had abandoned them in a foreign country. Uncle Mike had always been the responsible one in Dad's family, and he wasn't buying their version of events. He asked me to explain what had really happened. I told him everything. The stolen bonus, the abandoned grandfather, the note that treated an elderly man like a burden to be discarded. There was a long silence. Then Uncle Mike asked how Grandpa was doing. I told him Grandpa was actually doing well, better than he had in months. We'd settled into a routine, and I'd arranged for regular check-ins and home care. For the first time in years, Grandpa wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't apologizing for existing in his son's space. Uncle Mike said he'd had his suspicions about Dad's treatment of Grandpa, but hadn't wanted to interfere. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him that Grandpa would probably love to hear from his nephew, but that I had the immediate situation handled. As for Mom and Dad, Uncle Mike said he'd received similar calls from other family members. Mom was working her way through every relative she could remember, spinning increasingly dramatic versions of their plight. Uncle Mike had already warned the others to be skeptical. He did mention one thing that caught my attention. Aunt Sarah, Mom's sister in Florida, had apparently agreed to wire them money for plane tickets. They would be flying back on January 15th as originally scheduled. I thanked Uncle Mike for the heads up and asked him to keep me posted if he heard anything else. After hanging up, I realized my parents' return was going to create new complications. They'd be expecting to walk back into their old life, but that life no longer existed. I spent the next 2 days making sure all the legal documentation was in order. Grandpa's power of attorney was properly filed. The lease transfer was complete. The utility transfers were finalized. I'd also opened a new bank account in Grandpa's name, with myself as a signatory for his care needs. On January 14th, I had one final conversation with Grandpa about what would happen when his son and daughter-in-law returned. He asked if I thought they'd learned anything from this experience. I told him honestly that I doubted it. People like Mom and Dad typically learned that actions had consequences, not that their actions were wrong. Grandpa nodded thoughtfully. He said he'd been thinking about what he wanted to say to them when they came back. For the first time in years, he felt like he had some control over his own life. He wasn't sure he wanted to give that up again. I told him he didn't have to. The apartment was legally his now. The utilities were in his name. The bank account was under his control. If he wanted his son and daughter-in-law to live there, that would be his choice to make. But it would be his choice, not something that happened to him. That evening, Grandpa asked if I would stay a few more days after Mom and Dad returned. He said he might need some support while everyone adjusted to the new arrangements. I told him I'd plan to stay as long as he needed me. We spent that last quiet evening watching an old Jimmy Stewart movie and sharing stories about Grandma. For the first time since I'd arrived home, Grandpa laughed, really laughed, not the careful chuckle he'd been using around mom and dad for months. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and drama and probably a lot of shouting. But tonight, an old man was comfortable in his own home, and his grandson was there to make sure it stayed that way. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the people who matter most are protected from those who don't deserve them. The next morning, I heard keys in the lock at 7 a.m. It was time to see how much my parents had learned about family loyalty during their extended vacation.